Welcome, everybody. That's the episode number two with the Felman siblings. Hello once again, Mara, and hello once again, Alex. It's a great pleasure and that's the honor to have you both once again on the Global Wisdom Talk. And our topic for today, and that is probably very important and interesting for the audience today, is on family leadership, but not only on the pure family leadership, but we have selected the topic, the transition of the family leadership from one generation to the next. And that is probably the most maybe difficult, maybe easiest, maybe intensive period of time for the parents, but also for the children who are in the position to take over the leadership. So, welcome, Mara, and welcome, Alex.
Yeah, Jan, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be back, and happy to do this again for round two. I'm looking forward to our conversation.
Great. So, before we jump in the topic today, I will start with a little story. And the story is I will pick up you, Mara, and I will pick up you, Alex, just on the journey of my weekend 3 days ago. And the story is this: my little son was with me on the first time on the golf range. And he was in the position, he's 10, but he is quite interested to play golf. And that was just the first time that he have a golf club in his hand, and he was a little bit uncertain, and he said to me, "Dad, I don't know what should I do? Is it just holding this in this hand right, or is it just on the left hand side right? And how I can do, and what can I do that I hit the ball?" And if I hit the ball, is it just the correct way that the ball, maybe I can put it just in the right hole? And it was a little bit of fun, but it was also a little bit of a strange time because there was a little bit of disappointment in the air, but also a little bit of energy in the air because my son was very engaged to hold the golf club in the right hand and make it in the right direction to pull the ball in the right hole. And that reminds me a little bit on the transition of the family leadership. But before we jump in this whole topic, Alex and Mara, it would be interesting for me. What is your holistic view? I mean, if I put you just in a bird perspective, what kind of families are mainly these kind of families, from your perspective, who want maybe in a better position to take this transition of the family leadership just as better as I would say, the whole crowd? Do you have any idea on this, or do you have any experience from your network?
Maybe could potentially jump in first. I think let's say using your story almost as an analogy. I think the families that have strong on one side communication between generations, but I think it's a sort of a strong almost generation to generation learning that is happening and in kind of a having the older members of the generation be essentially historically in many communities, right? The older generations have been kind of wise elders. They've passed on knowledges, and this has both been in actual families, but also kind of, let's call it, mythically and in stories. And I don't know, I was sort of thinking a little bit in coming up to this, of you even see this in things like Star Wars or Lord of the Rings, right? You had groups like Obi-Wan or Gandalf. You always had this wise figure who's of an elder generation to pass on knowledge for kind of the current generation to go through various challenges that they will face and etc. Right? And I think the families that do have kind of this, I just think, let's say, have education being a core part of what they do is important. But I think also that education is kind of cross generational, and there is this kind of cross generational dialogue between the generations in an educational way. I think that's a big thing that that kind of, let's say, leads to this success. I think that's kind of the first point that I want to make, and it looks like my sister wants to jump in with either a different point or to tell me why I'm wrong. But go ahead.
Not wrong. No, no, I was thinking about this question too, and I liked your golfing analogy, but I was thinking about this as well, and I love to cook, and like especially when you see it of like information being passed down, and I think we all have somewhere that their grandmother makes some sort of dish, and they're like whether it's baking or something like that, and they're like, yeah, well, you just do this. You don't have measurements. It just comes out like this, which has and especially with and I think that's where I focus on is like, how do you build that, taking that knowledge and that roadmap that someone has this experience of who hasn't taken necessarily the time to think about those processes that went into and has all that experience and give it to an inexperienced person and really write some of those recipes down to key ingredients and um key structures, but also within that, like your son is not going to probably hit the ball straight on the first time and have that ability to have some of those setbacks so that they can build their own experience within there.
Yeah, I'm completely with you both, and what I bring just in the center is just what we often, I would call it, just underestimate. That's the culture, right? And especially the culture of the family. Yes, I mean many people are talk. Yes, we have a culture of failure, and failure are allowed, and but in the end of the day, failure don't allowed, right? It is just on this way of the transition. What kind of framework do you give the children or the family member, and what put you just as a culture inside of the framework that everybody has just the certainty, maybe also the uncertainty, a little bit of a pressure, but also just to feel safe, and that you can hit the ball maybe two, three, four, five times. Maybe you don't hit the ball, and do you allow to make just the next try? And that brings me just also to this question. I mean, uh, and that would be grateful if you can give me just, and also the audience, just a little bit open the door to your family, how these transition from one generation to the next of the family leadership is just happen in your family. Is it just through discussions, or was it just that your parents said from the next Monday you both just in the family leadership because we are tired and we want to make our time for ourselves and want to be on vacation? What was actually the process inside of your family?
I can kick this off.
Yeah.
I think there's kind of two parts to this. The first part is, I think for us, this transition is kind of still in process.
Mhm.
Is what I'd say. It definitely hasn't completely happened. Our families and our family office is still being kind of led by our father. But I think what has essentially happened, and for both of us at kind of different points in time, is that, let's say, both of us at various points in time were given specific kind of roles within our family office. And let's say over time, I think there's been both let's call it an increase in responsibility in those roles, as well as an increase in the ability to shape those roles in kind of whatever way we saw fit to a certain extent, and having a lot more kind of autonomy and agency about, you know, now that we were kind of, let's say, the leads or the experts in a specific area of what we did, then we'd get more autonomy about how we would approach those areas, types of things we would be looking at, et cetera, et cetera. And to, let's say, even sort of, initiate some of our own projects and so on and so forth. So I think that's been kind of a major way that we've been doing it. It's sort of been kind of a integration first, and then kind of build up over time. Almost not to say it's exactly the same, but I almost see it as in business they often talk about like a land and expand strategy, where you kind of claim one area first and it kind of grows from there. I don't know, Mara, if you want to add anything or whatnot.
Yeah, I mean, I think you kind of have described how we both, which is funny because I think we both kind of fell into this path, and even though we didn't really discuss it, and it was a more natural way, I would say, of like starting integration, but I would say, but this is the start. And like and I think what to look more to the future is to put a little bit more structure around that and to build from there.
Yeah, I think jumping off my sister's point a little bit, which is not really something that we did, but I think is something to look forward, is I think probably you could have potentially identified earlier or younger what areas make sense for family members to be integrated. I think for us, like my sister said, that they kind of happened a bit naturally, but also a little bit of just kind of almost circumstantial, if that makes sense. I know my personal story was essentially I was in between things and not really knowing what I was going to do. Moved home essentially as kind of I don't want to quite say a rest period, but kind of a transitionary period without really having a plan. And then being told, well, if you don't have a plan, I'm going to put you to work, and you have a skill set that we need, so I'm going to put you to work there. And that was how I joined the family office pretty straightforwardly. And honestly, I think it was quite helpful for me because it definitely, let's say, helped me during this transitionary period to kind of I don't want to say regain focus, but sort of realign myself, ground myself, go like, okay, now that I'm sort of doing some things, almost not exactly, but almost keep momentum and keep movement and keep trying things and being like, okay, now that I've tried some things, like, okay, this is what I think makes sense to continue the pathway forward. And that's how I kind of got looped in, and I've been involved ever since. As well as, like I said, but been using that as kind of a jumping off point to kind of, to a certain extent, shape it in some of my points of view of what makes sense. And kind of, it's I think all these things are kind of in a constant dialogue with the family office, but also its members, and then they influence each other, right? The office rubs off on the family, and the family rubs off on the office, so to speak.
Okay, that means your family office is the central point of entry for the family, and vice versa. Um, or have I understood this right? Or is it just just a vehicle to put all, let's say, the energy and the purpose and the legacy in the family office to fulfill this thing? Because the question as an add-on is just how the family office actually secure the well-being of the family, of the entire family. Is there any correlance at this time in your family, but also in the family office as a vehicle?
Um, I would almost, at least initially, of kind of, I would say, where we started, and I joined our family office like 11 years ago. And I think where things were at least then, and I wouldn't necessarily, let's say, if I think that was happening today, I'm not sure it would be exactly the same. I think the dialogue around this has changed, and I think the family's adjusted accordingly. Um, but I think to a certain extent, let's say, the family office became kind of a vehicle for the interaction of the family with the broader sort of, let's call it, business professional community or ecosystem, or whatever you want to call it, right? And so it became kind of a way for the family members to engage and interact with sort of this, larger kind of business professional finance conversation. And so I think at least certainly when I joined, I think it was more like that. And I think some of the things that you're talking about, I think has been kind of a newer growing movement and conversation within these spaces. And I think to a certain extent, and I think these types of questions are actually more questions that say me and my sister are kind of trying to answer or address or certainly maybe shape the dialogue within our family office to do more of these things of like, hey, if we're going to engage with the kind of business world or the investment world, like we also wanted to kind of meet our needs on a purposeful level. And so that's at least the way that I would kind of consider it and how I've seen this kind of develop over time.
Yeah, I mean, from my perspective, and we have this a little bit discussed also in our episode 1, is just I mean, if you come in a position to take over the leadership of the family, is often that you seriously ask the question, okay, what is actually the purpose of our family office, right? If it comes also on an evolutionary path, and how we can transition our family office, just that it will be in the end of the day just a pure family office, that the family office are in the end of the day just in my interpretation, often in the third stage will be a pure family office is responsible for the well-being of the family. Yes, invest the money, but also a large proportion to support each family member and have a learning organization. But in the end of the day, it's just also in a perspective from the leadership position to say, okay, how we can transition this vehicle, that it will be not only an investment vehicle, but also it will be responsible for the well-being of the entire family. Is this also in your view on the leadership inside of the family, of your family, or is there just in a discussion between your parents, or do you use eldership just as in counseling on this transition path?
I mean, I I think we were always ingrained with like from a very young age of like you take care of your family. Like I think that is just something we grew up with. Uh and that you help to support your family and in and very I mean depending what financially but also I think more also we were always encouraged as to kind of find our path to um without a lot of pressure, but had that support for our family to be there, which I know not everybody does, but I think that was always ingrained in just our culture.
Okay.
Yeah, I think sort of echoing what my sister's saying is I think this was something that was more, let's say, more family culture oriented than it was let's call it family office codified. And I think that is probably, and I'm not necessarily going to speak for my sister on this, but a sense that I would have is that, let's say, one of mine and my sister's, if you want to call it challenges or tasks or whatever term you want to use, would be to kind of, let's say, more codify or define what that actually means. Try to do it in a more systematic way. Try to, let's say, specify who qualifies, who actually is considered to be under this umbrella. I know, let's say, without giving necessarily too much away, but what my personal family is blended. How how do we loop in stepchildren and so on and so forth, right? That's a significant question for situations like this. And yeah, and I think that becomes it's quite interesting. We were talking, let's say, offline, and you sent me some stuff about kind of different phases of the family office that different generations kind of have to meet. And I think some of these questions are the challenges that me and my sister have to meet. And kind of this is what's kind of on our plate to kind of suss out, figure out, while let's say our father is the one who kind of laid down a lot of the foundations that kind of a lot of these things could be built on top of.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I kind of to your point, Alex, is that um who is included in that? And I think you see that when I've talked to other family offices who are of the third or fourth generation of families. And when you start to get really that far out, families become very big. And who exactly falls into this? I know other family offices that I've spoken to almost, I mean, it's like a family office of a board that like people opt in and opt out of.
Yeah. 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 Alex, you mentioned these interesting topic, and I will pick up this topic, the question of a blended family. I mean, this is just I would call that's the new normal what we see, believe it or not, and it comes up with potentially with some tensions, but also with some challenges. And can you give me just any idea? Have you inside of your family just tensions or challenges to bring your blended family in the whole organization, what I've called the Felman family, or is it just also that you are on your way to take over the leadership to figure it out how we can combine these new family time that each of us is just aligned on the whole strategy and vision of the Felman family.
Yeah, it's been, I think it's been, I would say, a somewhat interesting journey. I think on the whole, my family has been on the whole quite supportive. And I know for example, a simple thing is right around the time um, me and my now wife got engaged, we started to integrate my wife into some of the family office events and bring her on as literally kind of she's now kind of representing us. I think it does somewhat, not even like somewhat, it certainly helps that, and part, honestly, probably part of the reason me and my wife are together is we come from a somewhat similar background, from kind of coming from the tech side and entrepreneurial side and et cetera, et cetera. So it somewhat helps that, let's say, she has an expertise in the space, and considering where she's from a part of the world that is actually, let's say, less known to the internal family. So let's say similarly to what happened to me and my sister, there becomes kind of a clear of like, oh, we can integrate you in a way that's actually, let's say, beneficial for everybody, right?
Okay.
And it becomes a kind of a clear like, oh, we kind of it's almost a we know what to do with this to a certain extent. It becomes there's a clear vision of like, oh, here's how we could bring this together, because there's kind of almost a clear puzzle piece fitting, if that makes sense. So I think that's been something that has worked out fairly well. That has changed mostly for kind of career and professional reasons with my wife's job is kind of not allowed her to kind of be as involved on a regular basis, but that happens. I do think though at the same time, I think some of the challenges has been on, let's say, I would say it's been more on the cultural side, to be perfectly honest, of this and some of the cultural differences and I'd say I think it took a number of family members, let's say, a while to even know the country that she's from and things like that. And I think that causes tension. I think different family members, for example, have I think there's been a spectrum between different family members, for example, of how much they've accepted my stepdaughter. I don't think it's been, some have been more accepting, some have been less accepting. Um, and honestly, I feel like it's hard to do like a one size fits all for that, because I think it's been very, very different depending on who you talk to, as well as I think to a certain extent, right? It's some of that is probably, um, how would I say it? Uh, Almost tangential to those people's relationship with me, and so this is kind of an extension of how they feel about, let's say, some of the various, um, what's the right word I'm looking for? But I don't want to say conflicts, but tensions that we might have, or ways that we might butt heads. This spills over into that. Um, yeah, and I do think to a certain extent as well, um, and not that we've talked about this too much, right? But most of my family is in the U.S. I'm over in Latvia and Eastern Europe, and so let's say 7 hour time difference and what's it, 10 hours of flights, leaves a fairly good buffer zone of space that allows, I don't know, a lot of things to kind of, what is either side really going to do to a certain extent, right? Both sides can kind of do their own thing. There's only so much influence you can have when there's that much distance between the two parties, to a certain extent, right? And so I think both sides are kind of will do to a certain extent of what they want, if they kind of don't agree or whatnot.
What's the
I don't know. I'm curious, Mara, I'm curious what your thoughts on kind of the blending has been, from kind of the opposite side.
I think it's interesting, and you said blended because I'm married as well. But I also like Sam has no, I know him. My husband has no interest in being a part of this. Um, he'll come to it, but um, that's just like it's not his mentality of it's just not where his mentality is. Um, and for your end, and I think some of it is a lot of that, there is a huge distance between, where both of us are from New York City, even though I don't quite live in New York anymore. Um, or I don't live in New York and haven't lived in New York for a while now, but it's a 5 hour drive for me or an hour plane ride, which is much different than where you are in the actual physical um, being there. Because I do think I definitely I hope I'm on the ladder. I've always accepted your stepdaughter on the nicer side of that coin. But there's definitely some family dynamics there. Um, but I think it's partly, and as you were thinking, is that like it's just, and I think you see part of these conversations, and I think you've shown it as this family dynamic of um coming back together of going like we're close with our parents, but I would say that me and my brother are much closer. Even though without this we talk to each other regularly, we do those um contact, and I do think some of that tension is partly just they haven't spent that much time with them.
Yeah. And I think one thing I think is worth specifically mentioning around this, is pretty much, it's kind of really interesting. Is part of this is an aside, but kind of looping things back together. Um, Interestingly enough, I would say once I met my now wife, uh, it was kind of a pretty quick thing that I kind of I don't know. It was one of those things of kind of when you know, and it was really quick with both being with us on the same page and all these types of things. But kind of one of the interesting things is, so I moved to Latvia relatively quickly after dating a couple months. But the thing that then happened after that was within a couple of months of me moving, we hit the pandemic. And so we then had a almost 2-year period where, we couldn't build up the family ties. We were like, by various quarantines and travel restrictions and where there probably would have been, I don't know, I would say a minimum extra 1, maybe 2, maybe more trips to blend families. There was just a whole period of, oh, we're kind of building our own thing in our own bubble in Latvia, and my family's doing their thing in the States. And, yes, you can do some amount of that over Zoom, but I would argue to a certain extent, not always. I know, for example, Jan, me and you, we've kind of built up I would say, a pretty good relationship almost entirely off Zoom, but I would argue Zoom is much better for maintenance than for building things from scratch. It's sort of, once you kind of have a relationship with someone, it can help you, just keep it kind of going and just the way modern life is. Sometimes you see people when you see people, but you can kind of keep it alive. Where I think to actually build relationships over that, I think there's a certain amount of, how do you put it, sort of essentially relationships that are kind of forged through the fire of you have to do things together. You have to experience it. You have to look the other people in the eye while you, I don't know, even if it's simple things, right? While you go to dinner, you have to have meals. Like there are these things that are really, really hard to replace. And I think that's sort of a different aspect of this that kind of added a wrinkle that kind of potentially stunted some of the blending that could have happened. I know that we've kind of from our end, let's say post the pandemic, have kind of, I'd say interestingly enough, if we look at it on a frequency basis, I would say the 2 to 3 years since the pandemic, I think on a frequency basis, I've been going back to the States much more frequently, probably 2 to 3 times more frequently than the previous 10 years I was abroad, something like that. Whereas before I was going to the States maybe once a year, maybe once every 18 months. And I think since the pandemic, it's been almost pretty consistently 2 to 3 times a year. It's quite increased. And I think there's been an effort to also just see the family more often. There's been a number of various reasons for that and so on. But yeah, and I actually have to say, I think it's, I think some of that's honestly, I think my wife is kind of pushing of helping to kind of spur, let's get together more. And I think that's one of the things she's doing of I'd probably be, I don't know, the way I am, I'd probably, go about my business and when the opportunities come, I would go, but if they don't come, then eventually I know they'd come and so on and so forth. But being a bit more, let's say, active about pursuing and let's say making the opportunities happen over letting the opportunities come to you is I think something my wife has been doing about visiting the family.
Well, I think it's kind of interesting also on your end too, because I think there has been, or some of the just your wife being from Latvia, just some of the cultural differences between US and Latvia, like for some of our family were just harder to cope with. And I think as especially if you're our family is pretty international or is international, how do you deal with those different blending? And I mean, I think we're figuring it out. But definitely that some of those understanding and issues come from different cultural backgrounds.
Yeah, I mean, I completely with you both, and what I want to add is, I mean, I had these kind of discussion with my 2 daughters, right? One will be 20 this year, the other is 16, and we had a serious discussion about what if the boyfriend or the husband will be moved into the door, and what we are tolerate as a family, but on the flip side also how we make us as a family attractive, that not only that one of these guys are only why we are attractive as a family, one together with my daughters, but also be part of these family for the benefit for the entire family, just as in not as a liability, just as an asset, right? And to your point, Alex, what you mentioned to say, okay, how can this new member just part of a tribe? And that was just for me a hard journey to come up to reconsider that the family isn't just by bloodline. It is just, okay, what can we build and how we integrate ourselves as a strong tribe and what holds us together. And just as a little sentence, we have defined at one of our last family meetings just a one sentence, and this sentence is 1 second wow. And what I mean by this is just if there's just an outside viewer on our family, that should be automatically 1 second wow, or he said, no, that's too strange for me. I go further. But is it just if I come once again with this term, is it? I mean, more and more families will be global. You are just a pure example. You are in the States, Mara, and you are here in Europe, Alex. But it will be also. I mean, your your family potentially will grow over the next decade, right? And that means there are new challenges for the family leadership to hold the family together. It doesn't really matter whether do you in the US or do you in Europe or maybe your stepdaughter Alex potentially in Asia or in Australia. I mean, do you see this also as a huge challenge in front of your door to find solutions and pathway to as a new interpretation of family leadership to hold a global family together?
I mean, so my point of view on this is I don't think it's necessarily kind of a new challenge. I think this has been something that's been going on for a while. I mean, let's say going back a little bit, and if we keep this on the family office side, if we think of probably what's seemed to be one of the original family offices, which would be the Rothschilds, they almost did this intentionally. They kind of intentionally kind of split up the brothers, sent them to different parts of Europe so that they would have this kind of international network and they could kind of it would be beneficial for the family to have their sphere of influence in more than one place around Europe, right? So this has been something that's been going on for hundreds of years. I don't think this will necessarily be as big a challenge for us because let's say it's something we're already dealing with to a certain extent. But I think one of the fundamental things about this is, and I think especially increasingly so, is I think the challenges around an international family are not essentially are not technical. It's at this point fairly easy to structure. It's not particularly all that different than let's say an international organization, kind of a let's say a Fortune 500, not let's say exactly, but it's not all that different from let's say a Fortune 500 company, right? There's tons of companies that exist in the world today that are international. So that side of it, not that difficult. But what is one of the really big challenges that all these companies have, right? It's culture. It's how do we organize people that are in vastly different parts of the globe? How do we I don't know, keep family dynamics when, even though, like I said, we're 7 time zone difference and so on and so forth, right? That means realistically, there's a handful of hours in the day where it actually makes sense to talk to each other, right? Which means that like, if you don't hit those hours, then, and for whatever reason, then you might not talk for a week, a month, whatever, right? It's easy. It's much easier for those things to kind of, build up on you and disappear over time. And what happens, well, that leads to, I don't know, arguments that might have been dealt with in a 30-minute conversation don't get dealt with. And generally speaking, the longer they don't get dealt with, that just means that it builds up over time and gets blown out of proportion, right? You kind of, what's the saying? you build a mole out of an anthill or something. That type of, you have
Yeah.
a snowball effect.
Yeah.
It becomes an avalanche. Um, and I think that's sort of the bigger thing, right? It becomes harder to be, even with the tools that we have, like we're doing this through Zoom. Even with these tools, it still is somewhat harder to be connected in a really really meaningful way um, with having so many people distributed. And I think as the family grows, and let's say as the potential places families can be grow, the opportunity to bring the families together becomes more difficult. Um, where to do that becomes more difficult, and you just start adding these layers of complexity on and let's say I always think about this from kind of my side on the tech, my kind of tech brain is essentially every layer of complexity that you add decreases the likelihood of it happening. So
Absolutely.
something that might have happened once a year is now happening every 5 years, or something that was happening every 5 years is every 10 or 20. And so that's what starts to happen. And so then I think the biggest thing, right, is it's interesting. I'm gonna put this out there because it just kind of popped in my head. One of the big things that they say about startups is more startups die by suicide than by murder. And I think that's a really interesting thing that I think applies to families as well, right? It's more likely that the family is essentially going to self-destruct and they're going to do something themselves that is what's going to bring about their downfall. Then they're going to get like flanked by a competitor or whatever these kind of things you see on Billions or something like that. No, it's more likely that internal conflict is what leads to its own downfall.
Yeah.
And I think with these types of things that makes it more difficult for the family to come together is then going to make it harder to kind of resolve issues that pop up because it just becomes harder to get everyone in the room to actually work things out.
Yeah. Anything else from your side, Mara, on this point?
Um, yeah, I mean, I think all of it, right, is I've part of this conversation I've been thinking about, and it's like culture will win over organizational structure, and to Alex's point, how do you keep culture? And I think that's a point that not only family offices you're seeing in the business world as well is how do you create these cultures? How do you actually create, maintain, and then sustain
Absolutely.
this for a longer period of time? And I don't think it's just a family office because it's a big conversation in big corporate worlds as well, is that culture. But when it's the family, it's even more important, right?
Yeah, and it's also important the question, how do you inherit these created culture uh, over the next or to the next generation? But these next generation have the right and the duty to evolve these culture, right? Because that's different individuals. And so first of all, it's much appreciate your insights, and I will come um, to the end for today, and I will close our talk today just with a different question, with a final question. What kind of advice would you want both give someone from a family, it doesn't really matter who is in a transition to take over the leadership of the family, but also have a clear view to evolve this family just to preserve the legacy, the purpose, and stuff like that for the next 100 years. What kind of advice would you want to give them? Just from your own experience.
I mean, I think if you're starting to take over from the family office, I mean, one I'm always about is really start to understand the dynamics, like go through an evaluation period to understand what is working, what's not working, and where do you want to go. And what if you're putting the time energy into all of this, like what is the purpose, what are you trying to do, what sort of vehicle is and shape does this kind of look like for your family, and dynamics that maybe need to change or evolve into something else to build on.
That's great. And Alec, what was your advice on?
Yeah, so I think I'm gonna connect it to this and honestly give myself somewhat of a slightly shameless plug of something I'm working on right now. So at the moment, I'm in the process of writing a book on what I'm calling the exponential family office, which is kind of what I see as kind of the new family offices of the future. And people who might not be familiar with the exponential kind of organizations, one of the key components of them is they say that all exponential organizations have this massive transformative purpose. And so I think one of the things that I kind of put forward is I think one of the interesting things about kind of massive transformative purposes, I would like to think that they're one of those things that'll, be true today and be true in 100 years. For a lot of these things, a lot of them are kind of these big lofty goals that Bezos is kind of really famous for talking about this. He said he did a lot of his decision making on what's going to be true, no matter what the environment does, and it's sort of, to a certain extent, I'm paraphrasing him. He said something like, "People will want cheap things quickly." Paraphrasing him, but he said something to that respect. People will always want cheap things quickly. Paraphrasing him, but that's basically what he said. And I think that's one of the things that I think is kind of important for the families to sort of think about, like, okay, what is this kind of massive transformative purpose, and then kind of think about, like, let's have one that will be true in 50 years, 100 years, 1,000 years, because I think having something like that is what will help the family kind of stay together and will help people have buy-in over time. But also, I think, to a certain extent, and we didn't really talk about this, and maybe this is a topic for round three. I think one of the interesting things about the generational dynamics is I think kind of all the generations bring value to the table. And I think one of the really interesting things about, let's say, the older generation is they're really great at telling you what hasn't changed, what doesn't change over time, because they've seen it. And they will really know that, like, yeah, we've seen all kinds of changes, and here's the things that tend to stick around. And I think the younger generations are really good at telling you, okay, but here's the things that might be different this time. Here's the ones that maybe we should pay attention to. That this seems like it's, and maybe the older ones can be like, oh no, but we've seen that before, so maybe let's cross that off our list of what might be different. We've been through versions of that, but I think using that mentality of, like, hey, we've seen it, so here's what hasn't different. That they call that, like, the Lindy effect, if people are familiar with that. Older generation can tell you, here's kind of the Lindy effect. Here's things that have lasted a really long time, don't change, probably a reason for it. And younger ones will be like, hey, here's the things that are new that we should probably be paying attention to, and kind of add a wrinkle to the whole game. And so I think that's just a kind of an add-on to that.
Great. That was an amazing closing note. So many thanks. It was once again a great pleasure to have you both on this Global Wisdom Talk. It was an honor and also in this distinguished pleasure. Many thanks for your time, Mara, and many thanks for your time, Alex. And yes, I will take your offer, and let's plan round number 3 on this very important topic, transformative. I would call it just transformative power of family wealth. That is just what maybe in the end of the day holds the world together. Many thanks.
Perfect.
Thank you.
Thank you, Jan.